behalf of the Raza Foundation and India Habitat Center, we welcome you to this 7th V.S. Gaitonde Memorial Lecture Series. The Raza Foundation has been organizing every year 9 memorial lectures. That's quite a lot, but they are devoted to 9 masters that we had in recent times. Kumar Gandharv, the musician, Habib Tanveer, theatre man, Mani Kaul, the filmmaker, Gaitonde, the artist, Kelucharan Mahapatra, the great dance guru, Daya Krishna, a great philosopher, Agge, a great writer, Charles Correa, a great architect, and Janagar Singh Sham, a great tribal artist. So 9 of them. And this particular lecture devoted to Gaitonde's memory is not, and all these lectures are not about them. They are an attempt to create a critical mass of thinking and reflection on issues that may appear relevant and worthwhile to the speaker. In some of these lectures, very difficult to get speakers. Either the dates don't suit them or they feel there are not enough of them to pick up from. I can tell you that. And I can tell you that with knowledge of this field for several decades. So it's very difficult, especially to find people from music or for dance, etc. But we are very glad that we are able to find people, and illustrious people, for this particular lecture series. In the past years, it has been delivered by the artists Prabhakar Kolte, Krishan Khanna, Geeta Kapoor, Ranjit Hoskote, B.N. Goswami, and Rubina Karode. So it's quite an impressive list if you would like to consider that. Today we have Naman Ahuja, who, as most of you would know, you have heard him before, and if you haven't heard him before, you have missed something, and you can make up that today, this evening. Naman Ahuja, of course, is in the School of Arts and Aesthetics in the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has curated some very path-breaking exhibition. He is the editor of the celebrated Marg and is a wonderful speaker. And he has chosen to speak on establishing clichés, Shringara and Alamkara. I have no idea what he's going to talk about. So, I'm going to be listening with as much curiosity as you are going to. So, Naman Ahuja, please.
Well, good evening. Thank you all very much. It's nice to be amongst friends, and I have to say, it's also been very nice to be able to share this research with you today. I think the sophistication of Gaitonde's work in terms of his abstraction, the gentleness and the subtlety of his abstraction is a far cry from the kind of exact diametric opposite of the kind of material I'm going to engage with today, which is as florid and as representational as you can possibly get in the history of art. But somewhere in between the subtleties of abstraction and the hyper-realism that comes along with the desire to represent, there is somewhere a certain parity in the extremist views of both parties, which art historians often debate. So somewhere in this, I think it would be a kind of a homage to his work, because I'm going to bring up certain kinds of issues which move between music and theater to visual art and back to music and theater, how they become codified in a language of dance in India, and how does that become the standard cliché by which writers and poets began to be trained for centuries to come in Indian art, in Indian culture. Something of the genesis of that and the early history of that, as to how those clichés and tropes in literature were established, when they were established, what was the kind of training and exposure that writers and poets would have been given in ancient times. The evidence for that is wanting in the actual literature itself, but the visual culture of the 2nd century BC, when representation in Indian art first blossoms, seems to have a lot of answers for things that would be of interest to those of you who work in literature, as well as those of you who work in the history of theater and performance, and lastly, of course, for art historians who are looking at the history of representation. So, my talk today is really on ideas of what was regarded as beautiful, which seem to have become iconographic in South Asia by the 2nd century BC. The codification of the gestures of nayakas that allowed them to be classified into specific types of nayakas is seen on Buddhist monuments by about the 2nd century BC across many parts of South Asia. So it's not just in one place. These types also circulated amongst people in exquisite little ivory statuettes, and they were even mass-produced as terracotta plaques. So in this talk, I will summarize a study of their subject matter, their circulation, and their composition. The artist's angle of vision, when you're making something, the way you compose your picture, so the artist's angle of vision is quite deliberate, and it privileges a certain perspective which shows a very graphic display of sex, of eroticism. It's not actually, they're not interested in showing romance between a couple. If I saw a couple truly in love or something and they're hugging, and I've got a camera in my hand, or if it's a couple that's truly in love and even having sex, and I've got a camera in my hand, I'll be hard-pressed to be able to film the exact movement of the body parts. It's not a display for the public's attention as you would have in pornography, for the viewer to be able to see what is going on in the act of sex. Whereas in these artworks, the angle of vision is very much for the sake of display. It is not an angle of vision which is truly showing the romance between the couple, or truly showing a nayaka who is embodying those qualities. The qualities are being made for show. It's part of somebody's pedagogy and training to make things obvious for display, to invoke something and show, this is the Alamkara I am presenting to you. It is not a naturally born in, it is not a capturing of nature and of naturalness. The deliberateness with which it is being invoked and displayed is itself quite telling, because it's showing that there is a certain pedagogy that these artists and writers are being put through, and they are manifesting that in their work. Since the visual culture can be related to ancient literature and is archaeologically and paleographically datable, It allows us to posit the codification of Indian visual aesthetics surrounding questions of Shringara and Alamkara, beauty and adornment in Indian art, to the immediately post-Mauryan period. And my real specialization is in that post-Mauryan period of about 200 BC to 200 AD. And this fits very well within our research on the bilingual, theatre-going, poetry-appreciating, urban Rasik, who was called a Nagarika in ancient Sanskrit sources, who was this aesthete of this period. So over here you can see this is the fragments of a comb made between the 2nd and 1st century BC found in Bengal. And it shows a Nayika who's just come out of her bath. So she's got wet clothes on her body, her hair is wet. And if you think that the wet sari sequence was something that was invented by Bollywood, I'm sorry to disappoint you, it's at least 2200 years old. And it is much used all through Indian visual culture. Now she's got two little helpers, two little ganas on either side as she does, and it's an ivory comb. So it's invoking this particular Nayika in a woman's everyday object, a deluxe object, made perhaps for a more elite woman, but all the same it has a very particular evocation of a certain Nayika that has been carved into this ivory comb. The tendency to sculpt stories from performances and recitations into objects brings us to ask what sanctions or qualifies something to take the leap from a recitation in religion to representation. Just give this a thought for a second. We go to a performance, we see a Ram Leela. We go because it is part of a religious festival. Once a year, we go and witness the festival. An artist witnesses the same festival. He commits it to a narrative, turns it into a long sequence. Now, in the history of Indian art, we have long talked about the origins of the image of the Buddha, the origin of the image of Surya or Hercules or whoever else has come into the subcontinent. And different theories have been propounded on what leads to the creation of art. And art suddenly comes and bursts on the scene in India in about 200 BC. And my belief is that something is taking the leap from being performed into something becoming visual. What sanctions a performance to become something represented? And is the performed character somebody who can be prayed to? Is that actually a living personification of Ram and Krishna when you see it in a performance? Do you sit down like most of India did on front of their television screens, right? And on Sunday morning with their hands folded, because it was not an actor, but it was the vision of Ram himself. So during the period of the performance, while you're witnessing the performance, there is a behavior amongst the audience that treats the actor as the living embodiment of a particular deity. And this rather conveniently, we do have the Natya Shastra, which gives us very specific sanction that allows for possession and sanctions possession. Now, if possession is being sanctioned and is being talked about, what then takes the leap from possessed entity to become represented in art? That's the next leap that one needs to think about. So if listening to a bard recite a katha or law is part of a ritual, then is its representation also an invocation of ritual? Is that also a work of art the same way? Does it have the same status? And which stories become worthy of representation on public spaces and which ones can be used for personal objects? An image of Lakshmi stamped onto a terracotta plaque may be for veneration, but carved into the handle of an ivory comb alongside embracing couples shows that Lakshmi was an auspicious symbol borne in mind while dressing up, keeping hopes of erotic union. Sacred imagery could be employed for profane purposes. Right? You're using the Lakshmi on your comb while you're getting dressed in your Shringar with the hope that this is going to lead to a great hairstyle and you're going to look all the more attractive to your lover, and your intent with which the religious image is being used and harnessed is for a very profane purpose. So whenever we see religious images, our normal classroom teaching is that religious images were made for darshan. But it's a far cry from that. Religious images are being put to all kinds of secular uses. So we have to keep that in mind as well when we approach imagery. So in today's lecture, I shall trace the proliferation of characters like Sita in the Ramayana, Vasavdatta and Shakuntala, which employ certain narrative tropes in the guise of a religious pretext to elaborate on how a variety of expressions of the ardor of sexual union trumped their forbidden nature. Be it love between the king and a servant, or the king and a dancer, the plight of a courtesan, or winning your partner through abduction or elopement rather than through a consensual marriage, right? So the sanctioning of all of these forms of desire, passion was not just paramount, its many types were even codified and strategically emplaced in the public sphere, as well as on objects that were owned by people for their domestic everyday lives. So all of these different forms of passionate desire and these stories that embodied that degree of passion were being put as public statuary. And public statuary sometimes in very sacred places as well, on the gateways of the most sacred shrines by 200 BC. So we might regard the nature of the sexual union, not we, they may have regarded the nature of the sexual union as being egregious, as being unacceptable, but it was still an extreme form of passion. And that passion was so important that it deserved canonization and it deserved fixing. And so that quality of passion is something that they made iconographic. So I'm going to look first at actual scenes of performances, festivals, and processions that went on in ancient India at this time, between 200 BC to 200 AD. I'm going to look at prominent examples of kavya, specially found in plays that were performed in the post-Mauryan and pre-Kushan to early Kushan period, which means I'm essentially going to look at a lot of writings of Bhasha and Ashwaghosh. The dramatis personae employed certain tropes of certain nayikas in the art, as they do in literature, as they do in religion, and as they do in secular theatre. And this means that the same character type, the same protagonist, moves between different genres, different kinds of literature and different kinds of religious cults. There are lots of seats, there are a few seats here, 3-4 seats here, there's I think a seat here. Don't keep standing, please come in. So at the end, one needs to also look at all of this material and ask, who is this consumer of all of this? Who is the reader of this literature? And who is the person going to the theatre? What kind of, when you see your publishers producing a huge amount of a certain type of text, of literature coming out in a certain period, we can actually make assessments for what was the general nature of social consumption in reading habits at a certain date and time, right? We know that this book sold 40 million copies at this date, while that sold 5 copies at that date, or whatever it did. And we make certain assumptions about reading habits and so on. Well, what was the nature of the Nagarkar's gaze? Is he a reflexive aesthete, and how patriarchal is he? Is something that I'm giving the conclusion away because it's a leading question, but I would like you to bear this in mind while you're looking at the images, because it'll become manifest as we look at the images, because there is a certain self-reflexive aesthete, but he does seem to be located in a rather patriarchal society. And that's the person who has the agency, who's calling the shots, for whom the literature is being written, and who is commanding the art that is being made at that time. I don't think much that I would love to be able to offer an opinion on Hala's Satyasai being looked at as a text which has women's agency. I know it's been talked about like that in a lot of circles of literary criticism, but I think it's got more to it. There is an inherently male desire, even in Hala's Satyasai, but we can debate that for those of you who are interested. Okay, so the actual scenes of performance can be at religious occasions and per a ritual calendar. They can be in the form of masked performances, which are both Indian and Hellenistic. They can be dances at festivals to Indra, for instance. The Indra Maha is one of those famous Mahas and Samajas that would happen at this time. Now, Ashoka Maurya was not in favor of holding these different Mahas and Samaj gatherings. He tried to ban them. Well, he tried to at least, he couldn't ban them, but he did try and dissuade people from going to them. And one of the main reasons was that, for those of you who've been in the past 1 week witness to the drum and bass of the Kavadiyas roaming around the city of Delhi and been shaking and quaking as they walk through the city, you would understand that public processions can be quite an affront. Public processions can be menacing. They can be, there's a certain mass mobilization. And in an age when mass mobilization involved the killing of hundreds of animals in public ceremonies, they had become a very bloody public event. Many of these ceremonies were noted for blood sacrifice, and Ashok, as a good ahimsak, wanted to end those samajas and mahas at least which would have animal sacrifices associated with them. So by default, by reading his inscriptions, because of what he is disinclined to support, one learns about the kind of things that were prevalent. And one actually can compare that with a lot of information in even Buddhist texts, where there is a slightly ambivalent attitude towards these public processions and festivals. Some festivals, they seem to deny and try and block and say good people like Gautam and other monks do not participate in those processions and festivals. And at other times, when it comes to the Rukha Maha, the festival of the tree, or the Vriksha Maha as we say it in Sanskrit, that's something that they accept. The Indra Maha is one that they accept. The Thupa Maha or Stupa Maha is one that they accept. So they create their own body of festivals. And what's quite interesting in these festivals is that the violent actions of bodily sacrifice or blood sacrifice are substituted with ordinary clay objects being put in the place of the donation of a real animal. So instead of putting up a bull for sacrifice, you offer a little clay bull. If Hariti or some other ogress like Jeshta or somebody demands blood sacrifice at her shrine to be able to keep a pestilence away from the village, instead of actually donating a child at the shrine, you make a little effigy of a little baby and you offer those effigies. To protect your son, the parents go with a little clay effigy. So this substitution has a very strong theoretical basis. And it's taken me a few years of plowing through Prakrit sources in Jain texts as well as Buddhist texts, as well as looking up a few Sanskrit texts of this period, to be able to see how far back we can go with both Anukaran, with mimetic substitution, and as well as how far back we can go with Pratinidhi. And they've been quite useful to to look for the antiquity of these terms and the ways in which these terms are used in the Sanskrit texts of theatre, and to see what works as a pratinidhi, what works as anukaran, as a mimetic substitution. And that actually has allowed me to confidently posit this material where a fundamental difference is taking place in South Asia between the 5th and 3rd or 2nd century BC, which is a shift from Vedic yagya to what we call the Puranic system of puja. Puja is directed to a personalized deity. There is an act of devotion involved in puja, whereas a Vedic yagya is to an impersonal god. It is not a form of ritual that really requires a devotion to be expressed at all. There's no love or bhakti involved in any Vedic yagya. It's not a prerequisite for any Vedic yagya. So a conflation is happening between two societies in this period between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC, when concepts of yagyas are being conflated with the kind of personalized devotion that is there to the Rukha Devata, to the Indra Maha, to all of these forest-dwelling deities, to the yakshas and yakshis that we commonly call, how we address them at this moment. And the two societies are being put together into single spaces, into shrines. And theatre and performance plays a very significant part in doing this. Now, one of the main reasons why we know this is also because of the wonderful information that A.L. Basham was able to piece together for the history of the Mankha. A Mankha is a bard, right? A singing minstrel, like your Bhopa, who carries a scroll of pictures in Rajasthan. And during the period of the performance, the scroll is a consecrated religious object. He recites the story, he becomes possessed with the deities, he becomes Babuji, and he tells you the story of Babuji as he goes along with it. Now, it's in the same way. How old are these traditions? The Ajivikas, we are given to understand, the head of the Ajivikas, those of you who know your history knew that there were these multiple heterodox sects that came up that were contemporaneous with Jainism and the birth of Buddhism, and Makhali Ghoshal was the person who founded the sect of the Ajivikas. Now, Makhali Ghoshal would go into a delirium of dance and music. We're not allowed to use the word fana because that happens in a different age and context. But he was a person who was known to, the texts describe him as somebody who went into a delirium of possession, and music and dance were a means of deliverance. To be possessed through theatre and music and dance, and to be in such a state where you're in an altered condition, where you have lost control of yourself and your own cognitive mirrored self in relation to the world outside. You have reached instead a state of absolute union where you are acting on instinct and you are no longer acting in relation to the world around you. Right? That condition was one that could be achieved for Makhali Ghoshal through music and dance. Now, if that was the method that he was promoting, and this man is broadly contemporaneous with the Buddha and with Mahavir, broadly contemporaneous, about the same age, if that is one of the means, a religious path, where music and dance can have such a powerful outcome, then we need to understand that theatre and music and dance have to be given far greater attention by us as scholars to be able to understand what kind of a social role they were playing, rather than just looking at it as an entertainment in society. Now, one of the things that I got quite fascinated by is, for instance, we've never really known how Ashoka's columns were really used. What did people do with these 40-foot high larts that were put up in different parts of the subcontinent? And here you get a little bit in the Lucknow Museum has this Mathura sandstone pillar from a Vedika that shows a couple, a man and a woman, and we know that that's a woman because she's got these looped braids that fall behind her, which is a very particular women's hairstyle from the 2nd century BC. And they are circumambulating, they're doing a pradakshina of a pillar. And they're going around the pillar clockwise. And it's associated with a certain festival. There is a small orchestra, there's some musicians, and there's a woman dancing. And on the reverse of the same pillar, you have a mithun. There is a woman leaning back rather acrobatically as she reaches out to a man who's kissing her there. So obviously some kind of sexual rite, music and performance, and the pillar seem to be connected, circumambulating the ancient pillar. Now, what kind of ritual could this have been? And then we find a fantastic cuff, a large bracelet made of ivory for an adult woman, and importantly, it's carved with a freestanding pillar that has an elephant on top of it as a capital, and then there is a mithun couple beside it over there. So again, this idea of the mithun couple with the pillar worship. The inside of the bangle, incidentally, has all these yakshis made to touch the skin to protect the person who is wearing it. So there is something talismanic about the way these images are being used. Evidence for another ritual comes to us, another kind of a public performance. This is the worship of what we commonly call the thapa, or the panchanguli. On the base of the kumbh on which this goddess stands, this is an ivory plaque, so is this. Again, you can see the shoulders of the kumbh. You can see that there are palm prints. So going through a whole heap of Prakrit sources and even Vinaya texts, one finds references to this kind of worship, where older forms of blood-drenched hands, after participating in a sacrifice, either performing the sacrifice or participating in the sacrifice, blood-drenched hands were substituted with the use of alta, which is lak, and blood-drenched hands and feet were substituted also for sindoor or vermilion, right? So a mimetic substitution takes place in the ritual process. And of course, in a Buddhist ahimsak context, this has been totally replaced. The people still worship by putting palm prints, but now you would use, or you could use Rakta Chandan as the alternative. Never ordinary Chandan, it should always ideally be the red Chandan, right? And so this business of the red coming up each time clearly indicates that this is a mimetic substitution of blood that has now been replaced. And the people who are now coming to worship at stupas, rather than worshipping in the sacrificial processional environments, bring their previous practices to stupa worship. And there we have this lady leaving the stupa, having left her palm prints on it. Now this is at the National Museum in Delhi, and you can see it anytime you want. Similarly, we see more palm prints at the base of the stupa there. And this is a dormitory or a monk's cell, a vihar. And there on the base of, I'm sorry, the carvings are not that sharp, but these are all little palm prints all along the base, where the seat on which the monks, the bhikshus would have sat, that seat has been marked out with palm prints all the way through. Now, this they assume We cast our gods in the way we cast ourselves, right? We imagine the world of gods as an extension of our desires, and the highest imaginative realm we can take the matter to from our human realm, from our human imagination. We are constrained by the limits of our human imagination, capacities of our worldview. So one of the famous stories in Buddhism is that at some point Siddhartha sacrificed his turban. And जब उन्होंने पगड़ी उछाली, वो ज़मीन पे, it never fell to the ground. Instead, Siddhartha's pagdi could never fall to the ground. Such insult would not fall on the Shakyas. And it turned into like a swan, we are told. And the pagdi just kept flying, and it reached Tushita, the highest heaven. And once it reached Tushita, the various apsaras, and we're given the list of the names of the apsaras, who receive the turban, and they began to dance, and they held a festival in Tushita for the pagdi. And the turban relic has forever been, to witness and worship the turban relic, you can only reach Siddhartha's Ushnish when you yourself reach Tushita. Till then, you can't reach the highest realm. So the turban goes to the highest realm. And here you see these women dancing, and I've zoomed in on this relief from Bharut for two reasons. I need you to focus on the area, oh, my battery is dead, the area just below the pagdi, where you might be able to see palm prints on the pedestal. And if you look at the poses of the dancers, and you need to be able to see the fourth apsara, who is standing in a kind of a bandi pose, right? For those of you who know a little bit of your dance, with her knees outward, squatting, holding her hands up, her elbows shoulder height, and putting her palms in two pataka facing forward, right? And there she is in a very particular pose. Now, once you're in that pose, for those of you who are dancers, it's not much of a leap to understand how the woman, the one on the extreme left, and up is extending one hand down, while the one two is exactly the reverse mirror image of the same pose, one hand up and the other hand up, right? So it's almost like an entire karana that has been shown to us of very symmetrical, cognate, related movements of dance. This is not just a random depiction of dance. For those of you who know the vocabulary and grammar of the body in dance, would immediately be able to recognize this is not somebody whose elbows are coming down, whose body is shifting into a tribhanga-ish body pose. The angle, the very fundamentals of the structure of the body and the way that depiction of dance is shown with those four figures, it's coming out of a certain set choreography. It's a very particular set of dance. Now, this is implying that there might be a codification of dance that has happened in this society. Again, at the same monument, at a different portion of the monument, you see the same set of poses. An artist of caliber caliber has, at Bharut, can show dance in n number of ways. They've got body poses and body gestures and movement of all kinds on those monuments. But when it comes to showing the body in dance, there seem to be very fixed ways of showing the body in dance. No random movements in dance. Dance imposes greater iconographic constraints rather than the free-flowing body under normal religious bodies almost. And that seems to be, to me, to be quite impressive because it shows a certain codification of the history of Indian dance that is also taking place at the same time. Now, seeing it at one monument at Bharut, sitting in Riva and Satna in one little dot of India, that's one thing. Does that require then a classification? Can I say that this is a iconographic? Or was it local to Satna? right? Is it their tradition of dance? Now, this is the interesting thing. It's not actually. Because you come all the way up to Jamnanagar, Ambala. This is a plaque from Shug, which was in ancient times known as the city of Shrugna. And Shrugna has revealed some of the most exquisite ancient terracotta plaques and reliefs. And this woman who is dancing with her toes flexed, right, with one leg raised, seems also to be indicating the same thing of lifting her elbows up to the height of her shoulders, putting the two pataka in front, and be shown in much the same dance. When I first saw it, and I heard where it was from, and I said, Ambala, Punjab, Bhangra dancers, hands, shoulders up. This is 2,000-year-old Bhangra that is going on. Then it turned up all over Satna and Rewa also, and I said, no, Madhya Pradesh is not doing Bhangra. It's not that. It's something else. And there's got to be more to this as a codified language of dance. And so one began to think about these things a little more. And of course, as art historians and music historians, one is always delighted to be able to see female percussionists, female instrumentalists, and see them actually turned into ivory statues and depicted in the arts, where you don't just see male orchestras. And there seems to be no division between which are the instruments that women can play and which are the instruments that male musicians play. So whether it is flutes or whether it is string instruments with frets, fretted instruments seem to come in by about the 1st century AD, fretted strings. Percussion instruments, whether single drums or the mridangam, the double drum, both seem to be there by between this 1st century BC to 1st century AD period, and there are as many women players of these instruments. The most common instrument, of course, is the bow-shaped harp, which we, for want of any other word in Sanskrit, keep calling a veena. But a veena is a very misleading word because there can be n number of veenas. What is a veena? Is any string instrument to be called a veena? And when I first encountered these plaques, I only saw the bottom one on the bottom left, and that was in the collection of the Ashmolean in Oxford. And I was flabbergasted. I said, "Arey, this is an elephant-headed human," and I found the world's first representation of Ganesh. I was convinced that that's what I had found. And then I found, about a year or two later, another impression made in another tablet of clay that had used the same mold. And that's the remarkable thing about these 200 BC to 100 AD terracottas. They're mold made. And so they're made as mass production for city dwellers to be able to, as you would buy plastic today, this is the equivalent of their mass-produced objects that were being sold in markets for their mass production at that time. And if you can see, this elephant-headed person playing a drum is exactly the same as this one, absolutely identical. And then there is the leg of someone just above his head, and in that plaque, the leg is complete, and you can see the rest of the jigsaw, where this person is playing a bow-shaped harp. And interestingly, that bow-shaped harp ends in the face of a swan. Now look at that fellow, and you find this third plaque, and you see that fellow repeated, who's playing the bow-shaped harp. But under him, you see a fourth character, third character, who is dancing with a person. And then I found this another fragment, and you can see the rest, where they are dancing in front of a building which has a Chaitya arch, and there is a dance going on. There are musicians and dancers, and they're obviously not Ganesh, but they are masked performers. They're performers who are performing in front of a building, and they're wearing masks and performing. And of course, that immediately takes us to a very important Indian history of masked dances, From Kathakali to Chhau to Ladakh to any part of India that we look at, the importance of wearing a mask to become possessed and to have a transference, to no longer be yourself, but to have become the embodied entity. Now, if masks permit embodiment and transference, then during the period of the performance, this is no longer the actor, but is the embodied deity. And much the same way then, if spirit can move into masked actor, then spirit can also move into stone, or can also move into a kumbha, or into something else. The capacity of the migration of spirit is something that we are talking about. If that is sanctioned, then it need not be contained only to a living person like an actor. Then spirit can actually be invoked and be made to reside in a work of art, a two-dimensional relief. And then indeed, you're allowed to do something. What? Puja. You're allowed to have darshan. And you have a personalized equation with the divine, which is now an embodied divine. So art is now taking on the rules for possession, which is there in theater. So art making could not have come up without such a rich theatrical practice, and the remnants of that theatrical practice. Now in Kaushambi, from Kaushambi, this lies in the Allahabad University Museum's collection. And if anyone ever gets a chance to visit the Allahabad University's collection, please go and see it. It is extraordinary. It's very rich. And they have these masked performers. It's a tiny thing I'm holding in my hand, but it shows this masked ritual. Now, just as you have masked rituals and processions with masked figures, one also needs to think then about processions, public processions. And we get a variety of public processions. The streets can be occupied by a barat as much as the streets can be occupied by the kavadiya. Your traffic is held up, your house, you can't get out of your gate on either occasion. Both things, the street is occupied. The public has the right to occupy the street, right, on these occasions, right, whether it's a religious function or it is a wedding. How remarkable that ancient Indians understood this matter so well with what happens with public processions. And you see a public procession, I don't know whether that is a young couple being taken out in a doli or whether it is a yatra, like a Rath Yatra, which you would get in a lot of the Pahadi areas, etc., where they take out dolis with deities in them, rather than taking out chariots. But how remarkable that in the clay objects, we get to see an evidence that I'm trying to show you of a lived experience of ancient Indian society. Not the kind of ancient Indian society that we've been reading about in our standard history books, which has also looked so much at, not looked at this kind of a culture of the quotidian, the domestic, the everyday clay object, the everyday ivory objects that people had in their homes. Instead, they've looked at public monuments. But in the clay objects, I see something remarkable. Here is a procession where every single person in the procession is a woman. The trumpeter, the drummer, the bugler, the dhwaj or flag bearer, the mahut is a woman. Right? Even the mahut is not a man. Now, what kind of a procession is this, and what kind of a festival could it have been? I have not yet found any conclusive textual warrant for. We all know of women's rituals, women's festivals are rampant all over the country. How few of them are codified and written up in our texts or in our histories, because the histories are written by men and the histories are written based on Sanskrit sources, and the women aren't speaking Sanskrit, they're not allowed the Sanskrit, only a courtesan is allowed the Sanskrit. And who's representing and writing up the women's history from this period? And so since that entire 50% of the population's history is not being documented and their practices and their rituals aren't available to us, it's the clay objects that are being used in people's homes that allow us a window into looking at something of the quotidian sphere, the domestic sphere, and coming up with all of these other histories of the processions and rituals that they might have participated in. So this object has now been bought by the National Museum of Israel in Jerusalem, and it lies there. Just for you to know, I found it remarkable. I had seen it somewhere else, and then I saw it in Jerusalem, and I was shocked that it had reached there at some point. Anyway, now we get processions in ancient India, which are we know that there is a big history of processions, and here you get a samaj of, and can you see it's the same molded plaque? They're impressions from exactly the same mold. They're just different portions of the fragment. They're just in different magnification and light conditions. The earth has treated them differently as they've been buried. So it's musicians and dancers and two people carrying bales of, or carrying bundles of sugarcane coming in front of an elephant. And then I found the same thing carved on these ivory combs. The one on the top is in the Al-Sabah collection in Kuwait, and the one at the bottom, when I last saw it, was available for sale in London. But these are, they're showing the same scene of elephant and the procession and the sugarcane bundles being taken along. So I think it's possible, with that background of processions and theatre, I'd like to very quickly say that it's possible to be able to read Ashwaghosh's plays and see those characters in the material, to be able to see Bhasha's Swapnavasav Datta and see the same characters, to be able to see the Mrichakatika and see that in the art of the early Kushan into Kushan period, a few hundred years before Shudrak. So the interesting thing is that I will show you very quickly characters from these plays, which you are all familiar with as plays of Kalidas or Shudrak or Rajshekhar or Amaru's Shatak or anything which you know from Kavya, from the history of Kavya, but you will see the same characters, Shakuntala and so on. I'll show you the same things but made 300 or 400 or 700 years earlier than that playwright. But precisely that moment in the narrative, which means rather like the way Shakespeare was borrowing older plot lines and older characters and deploying them in his plays strategically, this was the case with many of our literateurs too, which means that some of these things were part of their pedagogy. When they were being trained as writers, they were obviously being given exposure to casting, create a piece of fiction which employs these 6 nayakas for me, and you have 1 hour to do it, and I'm waiting. And somebody is giving instructions where this codification is being employed by the writers, and that's the kind of training that these writers are going for. Otherwise, you will not see the re-invocation of the same archetype time and again, generation after generation, much before these things got fixed. So of course one of the favorites is, which V.S. Agrawal, Vasudev Sharan Agrawal had first identified, which is the story of Udayan and Vasav Datta. Now the problem with the story of Udayan and Vasav Datta is that it is across literature. There are so many plays in which these two characters emerge and fall in love, and the relationship between the teacher and the student, and what happens in the relationship between the teacher and the student, and how they run away with each other, and how he is so adept at mastering looking after the elephants. And V.S. Agrawal managed to capture and notice what the scene was because he identified that, I've forgotten the name of this elephant, this famous elephant on which they elope. Anyway, it's a cow elephant, and they, what, Bhadravati? Thank you. Yeah, yeah, I saw a little bit of a movement of your, I just triggered my mind, thanks. Now, Udayan is throwing coins behind him so that all the king's men and all the king's horses will not be able to catch up with them and stop them from escaping, basically. So he distracts them by throwing coins behind him. And they're wonderful coins because if you really take excellent pictures with a shaft of light coming at an angle and zoom in with a macro lens, you will see that they are punch-marked coins. Exactly the kind of punch-marked coins that you would get at that period in time in 200 BC. But the plot line is clearly of Udayan and Vasavdatta's story. Now, same way, if I look at Ashwaghosh's text. Now, this is a text from the Buddha Charita. Shouldn't just monopolize only the artwork. Let's read a few lines of the kind of theater and recitations that the public at that time was listening to. And I'll read out an English translation. Now, this is a moment when the women are trying to seduce the Buddha, Siddhartha, from his meditation. As if somewhat nervous, the public women made gestures designed to cause rapture with brows, looks, and blandishments, with laughter, frolicking, and movements. Then some of the young women there, pretending to be under the influence of intoxication, no culpability, pretending to be being intoxicated, such an old trick, touched him with their firm, rounded, close-set, charming breasts. One made a false stumble and clasped him by force with her tender arm, her arm which is like a creeper, which hung down loosely from her drooping shoulders. Please remember this image. Her arm which is like a creeper that hung down loosely from his, right, trying to. Another whose mouth with copper-colored lower lip smelt of spirituous liquor whispered in his ear, listen to a secret. Another who was all wet with unguents said as if commanding him, make a line here in the hope of winning the touch of his hand. So grabbing his hand and putting it to her body and say, touch me here, make a line here, draw this, do this, etc. on my body. Another repeatedly let her blue garment slip down under the pretext of intoxication, and with her girdle partly seen, she seemed like the night with lightning flashing. Some walked up and down so as to make their golden zones tinkle and displayed to him their hips veiled by diaphanous robes. Others grasped mango boughs in full flower and leaned so as to display bosoms like golden jars. Another lotus-eyed damsel came from a lotus bed and with a lotus and stood by the side of a lotus-faced prince as if she was Padma Shri. Another sang sweet songs with gesticulations to bring out the sense, reproving his indifference as it were with looks that said, you deceive yourself, because he's not getting seduced. Right? He's not getting seduced, so now she's getting frustrated and she's taunting him and saying, who are you kidding? You're only deceiving yourself. Right? So she says, you deceive yourself. Another imitated him by drawing her brows on her fair countenance and making gestures in mimicry of his solemnity. A damsel with fine rounded breasts and earrings shaking with her laughter mocked him loud, saying, finish it, sir. As in, finish your meditation or whatever it is you're doing. Please just look at the methods of taunting and seduction that this playwright has worked into his narrative. What a thrill it was for theater at that time to see all of these human reactions being played out, where there is that single Siddhartha sitting there on the stage, unmoved by all of this that is going on, but it's casting these women in very particular tropes of seduction. of how seduction can be performed. The text goes on like that. And that is exactly what we are seeing in the world around us. We've always seen these erotic yakshis surrounding the stupas. But we've never understood where these character tropes are coming from. And they are coming from the world of the literature of that time, from the theater of that time. Now, I've often talked to my students about a woman getting dressed, a woman putting kajal on, a woman putting lipstick on, whatever, getting dressed, putting on her makeup. Who finds that erotic? Who's interested in looking at this? Who's interested in capturing this? Like, all the women in this room who put on kajal every day on their faces, if there's another woman putting on kajal, you're not going to be sitting there looking at her putting kajal on her face. You're not interested, right? You care not. Find a man in the room, and he's mesmerized at the sight of a woman putting on makeup, right? He's sitting there watching how it's done, etc. So all of these scenes, implicit in this woman getting dressed, being given her makeup, being given her jewelry, being given her... Implicit in all of this is a certain male gaze. It's being performed for a male audience. Because only a man who is a heterosexual man who is interested in the Shringara of a woman would be interested in watching this narrative pan out in this manner where it would take on a theatrical dimension of seduction. Otherwise, it just doesn't really add up to commit it to stone time and again. The Lalita Vistar has similar lines like the Buddha Charita does. We don't have time, but there are wonderful passages. All the women assembled in front of the Bodhisattva and began displaying the 32 ways of female trickery. Right? Now, the author has very clearly given us not one, not Ashtanayaka, but 32. So he has created a cast of 32 women who are going to come on stage. One by one, each one is supposed to do her seduction number, or that one same dancer is supposed to obviously do these 32 mudras and karanas before she exits the stage. She has to perform these 32 roles before she is allowed to leave. So it's a very clear depiction of a recitation system and a performance system. And of course, some of the girls partially cover their faces, some show their firm and voluptuous breasts, some smiled at him and flashed their teeth, some lifted their arms, there you go, waving them in the air to reveal their armpits, some flaunted their lips, etc., etc. It goes on. And it's the seduction is, for those of you who study art and you know a little bit about sculpture, what I've always asked people to notice with regard to the Mathura yakshis is that please notice the clothing. Now, is it by accident that a sculptor has spent a few months carving this piece of stone, leaving that ribbon to fall precisely in the middle of her legs? That knot could be falling on the left, it could be falling on the right, but to make the end of the ribbon fall thus, precisely like that, not in one sculpture, but across 50 sculptures, where you see this detail repeating, where there is this partial revealing, this gradual concealment, there's no flagrant display of the body parts. But there is this very measured seduction that is taking place exactly in line with what the texts are saying. It's a mild revealing of the body, the portion of the cloth, the diaphanous cloth just about falling off her chest and so on. The way it's described in the texts is exactly the way it's panning out over here. Now we get specific jatakas as well from that time. they too give us long texts of exactly how the seduction is supposed to take place and how they're supposed to move their bodies to be able to seduce. And then you see this. What is she doing? She's tying her dhoti, right? She's just tying the belt which is going to keep her dhoti in place. And again, the ribbons are, the ends of it are falling between her legs. When I first encountered this particular fragment from Kaushambi, which showed a Rakshas abducting a woman whose ornaments are fallen on the ground, I knew I had seen the Ramayana scene, and this was the abduction of Sita. What I did not realize was that this wasn't Valmiki's Ramayana, but it was a version of a Ramayana that was popular amongst Buddhists. And I went on a wild goose chase for years, tracking down the various Buddhist versions that had gone to China and Vietnam and Central Asia that actually held from in very ancient times by the Kushan period that actually had the abduction of Sita, or Gopa as she is often called in those texts. And I was surprised to find that there were very precise Buddhist depictions of this scene. And that explained why we were finding that in the precincts of the Ghoshitaram monastery of Kaushambi, the Buddhist monastery of Kaushambi, because I could never understand why is Valmiki's Ramayana present in a Buddhist monastery in Kaushambi. Then, over time, I began to find many other depictions from ancient Buddhist sites. All of these depictions of the abduction of Sita. And finally, I began to see it on these Grand Shunga period pots, which show these abductions scenes. But the most conclusive evidence came from the entrance of a cave at Nasik, a Buddhist cave at Nasik, where, you know, at entrances to Hindu temples and to Buddhist temples, we put Mithun scenes. And in amongst the Mithun scenes that are placed at an entrance was this abduction of Sita. And I was saying, in our politically correct discourse in the university today, a rape sequence in a film, we know that the 1970s film directors threw in the rape sequences in order to be able to bring an erotic charge in the cinema, right? However, this is politically incorrect and completely reprehensible in today's day and age, where you would not want rape to become a reason for seduction. You're not supposed to influence men to be attracted to the concept of rape, right, and forcible, non-consensual sex. However, the history of non-consensual sex being something that is erotically charged had been made iconographic with the abduction of Sita. And that iconographic quality is then placed at now, the uppermost scene is the abduction of Sita. It's at the entrance to a Buddhist cave. Right below it is the drunken Vasanta Sena. Then below that is a standard Mithun couple embracing. So as I was saying in the beginning, it's the importance of passion, even if it is a forbidden kind of love. But it is the importance of passion that makes it worthy of being placed at a religious institution's entrance. Just at the moment where you would have the Buddha's ashes, surrounding it and protecting it at the very entrance of that shrine, you would put these Mithun couples at the very end. So when you see these in medieval Indian art at Khajuraho, and you see it in the poetry of the 7th to 12th century poets, you know that it's coming out of a long history. Now, it's not just happening in Maharashtra, it's happening in Odisha. This is the Rani Gumpha cave in Udaygiri, where again in the top right corner you have the abduction. This is the Rakshas abducting the woman. We get it twice, in fact, in the Rani Gumpha and Ganesha Gumpha caves. We see it at a Jain stupa, at a place called Vardamanur, which is a Prakrit of Vardhamanur, which is Vardhaman for Mahavir. It's a stup near Amravati in the Deccan. It's a Jain stupa. Now we know that there is a Jain version of the Ramayana story with the abduction of Padma, the Paumacharya, which is an equally ancient text. Not as old as Valmiki, but they're as old as the Buddhist versions. So sometime or the other, the standard Ramayana story had become normative. The Valmiki text had become ubiquitous. And the Buddhists made their versions, and the Jains made their versions. And the idea of the Rakshas Vivah, which Manu has to then codify years later, is something that has become part of the society in terms of, this is not a Gandharva Vivah, this is a Rakshas Vivah, where there would be an abduction against her will, non-consensual, has become something that has got an iconographic fixity in that society. And it is a part of Kshatriya Dharma, where this becomes an acceptable form of marriage, right? So, well, I'm getting sociological now, but anyway, there are many scenes which have been identified as the drunken courtesan, and they used to earlier be called bacchanalian scenes. I don't know whether they're really bacchanalian or not. I mean, I don't know if they're specifically Dionysiac or Bacchus related, but there is the drunken Vasanta Sena, and it's been associated with the plot of Mrichakatika. And there is a certain moment in the play where you see this particular scene. It could be identified with two moments in the Mrichakatika. Now, this is in the National Museum, but there are 5 or 6 others like it. And I was amazed. I said, very rarely are non-Buddhist subject matter made into such big stonking sculptures. There must be a Buddhist version of Shudrak's Mrichakatika. It must exist in some Jatakas and so on, and indeed it does. The same characters do appear in Buddhist versions. And that began to explain these small terracottas, which also show these hands like creepers, like latas, which are falling on either side, where the man, the lifeless arms that are falling, and the way the man is lifting her and putting her on the charpai, or undoing her skirt. The reason we know it's Vasanta Sena is because her anklets are no longer on her feet, but they've been lifted up and put up to her knee, which is a very specific moment because she's walking through the city at night and she doesn't want anyone to hear that she has gone through the city. So it's a very particular moment in the play when she lifts her anklets up to her knees so they don't make a sound at night. Now, to have that depicted in sculpture brings me back to the question with which I started my lecture. Why are they suddenly interested in representing theatre in stone? This is not a public which is an art gallery going public that wants these big fat sculptures to decorate their living rooms, right? So, or their gardens. So what are they made for? And how is theatre impacting it? And I think the answer for that is that I think a lot of this theatre is religious theatre. There are iconographic moments in the history of that religious recitation, that bardic recitation, and therefore, because they are associated with religious instruction and religious stories, but they have all the same rules of poetry and prosody that you would normally learn as if you were a secular writer, as indeed Kalidas and others were. But you were taught all the same rules, but the rules were being employed for religious theatre at this time. Okay. And indeed, you start seeing this, the Nayika Bhed that we talk about, the girl lost in her reverie because she's dreaming of her lover, but she's not looking at you and me. Her eyes are gazing away as she is playing with her earring. She's lost in her thoughts, and the picture is of a woman playing with her earring, but she's not gazing straight at us. I mention this because in the history of art, we always talk about art of deities, and deities are made for darshan, and darshan means eye contact. But here, it's an investment of bhav. This is clearly an iconography of a communication of mood. this Yakshi or this Nayika has not been made for some religious instruction only. This is clearly for the instruction of, for the communication of a mood that is invested in her. And these moods become something, as I say, iconographic. So in an oft-quoted passage from Shakuntala, we are told that she creates excuses to delay her departure and catch another glimpse of her lover. And so she leans back to pull the thorn out from her foot, to look back over her shoulder and see Dushyant in the distance, right? To have one more glimpse of Dushyant. That's exactly what we are seeing over here, except this is 500-700 years before Kalidas, right? Where the woman pulling the thorn out from her foot. So you see it in ivory, you see it in clay, you see it from Kaushambi, you see it from Bengal. Or that famous moment where Bharat counts the teeth of the lion, putting his hands into the jaws of the lion and counting his teeth. From Bhita, which is near Kaushambi as well. But all the way to Afghanistan, Claude Rapin published a monograph of the excavations in Ai Khanum, where in northern Afghanistan, where the Shakuntala relief story is there on a medallion. And that is dated between the 3rd to 2nd century BC. Now the Shakuntala medallion from the clearly 3rd to 2nd century BC excavated context. The pictures I had were so bad that I didn't include a slide because you wouldn't be able to, it's very hard to read the object. They found a silver lota in Himachal Pradesh in a village called Gondala. It was sold pre-partition by an art dealer in Rawalpindi to somebody who was collecting things for the British Museum. And this scene too has been identified. That's a line drawing. It's actually a silver lota. It's not that golden color. And it has this entire procession of Dushyant on his chariot going for the deer hunt, encountering Shakuntala, and the rest of the story, synoptic versions of the story that come up on it. Now, the Alasya Kanya, that's another Nayika type that we get, right? The one who is lifting her arms up, stretching. The Khajuraho artist is a great one for showing this particular pose because he shows her from the back as if you're lying in bed, watching her wake up in the morning, stretching and seeing her arched back, imagining her chest absolutely open and exposed, right? I mean, that's it's a full bosom display, is that this scene is it's for capturing that as a moment. And seeing it for just a dancer is one thing, but now seeing it with the woman who stands almost Tribhanga-like in front of, next to a pillar shrine, makes you think that these Nayikas are being used and are performing these things in a religious context once again. And how the tropes of secular drama are being incorporated into religious contexts. And the reason they have survived, the reason we as archaeologists and art historians have access to this material is because it has survived in a religious context. But that doesn't mean that it was art in the service only of religion. That means that these were tropes that were across society that were also being used in religion. I'm not going to read out Hala's poetry to you for those of you who want a little taste of some of the most dramatic erotic verse ever written in the history of the world. Please read the Gatha Shaptashati, the Hala Satasai. It is truly an extraordinary piece of writing, and the voice changes. Sometimes an old woman, sometimes a younger woman, sometimes a widow, sometimes a lower caste one, sometimes it's across. If you ever wanted to understand intersectional sexuality, as they nowadays call it, read Hala Satasai. I really feel it is a classic work to be able to do that. The Nayika Darpanika, the one who is looking at herself in the mirror, in images of wood and clay, Mathura, Chandraketugad, Kaushambi, the one who talks to the parrot. Amaru's Shatak makes much of this. The Tuti Nama of Akbar makes much of this. The Tuti Nama relies on the Shuka Saptati, an older text which talks about the dialogue with the parrot and the pet parrot. The pet parrot is a great story, right? The girlfriends get fed up of her always talking about her boyfriend, so they buy her a parrot who takes her boyfriend's name all the time because they say, like, we can't hang out with you. Here is a parrot, he'll only keep taking the name of your lover all the time because that's all you're interested in talking about is him. So we buy you a parrot. Then the other one is, of course, the parrot that reveals, that picks up the words that it has heard overnight between her and her lover and becomes the surveillance mechanism of that time, that husbands buy their wives and leave in the house so that the parrot narrates to them the following day or when they come back as to what happened and what words the parrot heard while he was away. So these parrots feature as a prop in many of these kavya texts. And the interesting thing is that they form a very consistent motif with the Nayakas all along between, again, the 2nd BC, Nagarjunakonda, Kaushambi, Mathura, 2nd AD. So that 400-year time span. I had doubts about the authenticity and the dating of some of these pieces. I've given you the test reports of the lab reports on the actual thermoluminescence testing of these objects to be able to take the dates back to the 2nd century BC. The most startling is the Karpura Manjari, which is the name of a very famous play written by Rajshekhar, where is a 7th century playwright. But this is a motif from Punjab, from Sanghol, from the Buddhist stupa, which shows the same woman. The Karpura Manjari is the woman who is got wet hair and she is squeezing the water out of her hair while a Hans picks up the droplets of water that fall. It's a very specific motif. It's not incidentally that there is this Hans in the bottom and there is Haveni coming down. You know, it's not. It's a very specific scene that is picked up. So what I'm getting at again and again is that the visual corpus, the art history, the visual data from the 2nd century BC is providing us clues which the literature and the texts from that period sometimes can't provide, but later texts do provide. Kalidas and Rajshekhar, a few hundred years later, do provide. Now this should allow me to summarize and say that, you know, if this is the level of social aesthetics that are spread out in society at that time, if these are the kind of things that are consistent, whether in clay or in stone or in ivory. Now here you can see it looks like the same object, but one is made of clay and the other is made of ivory. And that means that these things are now completely iconographic by the 2nd century BC. It's an extraordinary milieu in which there is such an anchoring of the systems of kavya. Now, for those of you who are students of literature would know that kavya is rooted in Prakrit. It's not actually rooted in Sanskrit. Whether it is in Buddhist texts or in Jain texts, we all know that the great kavya writers always say that they have used Prakrit as the base to be able to learn and to be able to express in Sanskrit. And that fits very well with what we know about the kind of Buddhist and Jain context in which art is also being made. Now, into this very strong anchoring of Indian aesthetics, the establishment of Indian aesthetics, we must pay attention to something else. The urbane Indian at that time is intrinsically connected with trade from Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Rome. Deeply connected in their daily artifacts and their daily trade. And so a question has been raised, whether India developed its history of theatre and tradition of theatre on its own, or did it develop its tradition of theatre because of the impact of Alexander and the trade that was happening with the Hellenistic world? Was it the Greek traditions of theatre that came to India in the 3rd century BC prior to the material that I am showing you? And I don't think so. I think that the Greek theatre does come to India, and Indians love consuming it. They love consuming the Indo-Greek, an Indo-Greek form of theatre does get created, which is got unique bits of Indian characters and Greek dramatic characters being fused. And that is an interesting fusion that is taking place in the art in this period up until the Kushan period in the Indo-Roman trade, Indo-Hellenistic trade. And just as you see in the northwest frontier, you have Cupid and Psyche being shown over there. You have Perseus and Andromeda being shown in Kolhapur. Now Kolhapur is connected with Naples on the sea trade, as it were, and Gandhara, the northwest frontier, is connected on the Silk Road, on the land route. Both are consumers of Western erotica. Just as much they are developing their own canon and traditions of erotica in India, they're as fascinated with Western erotica. And mind you, the consumers in Rome are equally fascinated with Indian erotica. Right? They too want the famous Pompeii Yakshi, the ivory statuette, that beautiful, seductive Yakshi. They too are consuming that. She's a Darpanika that they are consuming in their society. So here in Mathura, we have the depiction of Dionysiac rituals under a grapevine, playing Greek instruments, using Greek vessels, but made out of Mathura sandstone, and it's clearly a Dionysiac ritual, but happening in North India. And Dionysus is the god of theatre, apart from wine. He's also being mixed with the cult of Yakshas and Shiva at this time, because both are, of course, worshipped as the great phallus, both are worshipped as the great transformative agent. We have other things. We have this silver cup. I'm just showing you a few things. This was found from Gandhara. Completely Hellenistic Indo-Greek ritual. There is a rustic tree. There is a fortuna, an altar table. The eagle is a personification of Zeus. You see this cherub with wings holding a theatre mask onto his face. It's a Greek theatre mask, but it's a Greek theatre mask in the northwest frontier in Punjab, in a silver cup that they're using. So I want you to get an understanding that there are indeed the Indian theatre has its own deep tradition in Prakrit, and it is also encountering Western theatre at this time in 200 BC to 200 AD. And there is a dialoguing that which is taking place, which brings us to everyday objects like these combs, which I was looking at earlier, which show these kinnars made on the comb, or this woman in her attire, or this Mithun couple. This is what I was saying. There is a certain aesthetical nagarka that is around in that society. And they are consuming this kind of erotic art and material, where these depictions of sex become normative and codified. The examples I'm showing you, and I'm going to end now in literally 5 minutes, and I'm sorry I've taken so much time extra. It's there in Patna. These depictions of sexuality go up to Gandhara at this time, where Mithun couples are made on the entrances. They go to Maharashtra on the caves of buildings. They're there as tiny little terracottas. In all of them, you as artists must look at these objects to see what is the angle of viewing, as I was saying. That's what I wanted to end with. For who is this being made? And in each of these depictions of sex, of these Maithun scenes, the angle, the position of the characters is such that these are not romantically involved with each other. They are displaying the sexual union for us to be able to see what's going on. It's what we would today call pornographic, the angle of vision. The camera angle is one where it's being displayed to us to be able to best get the vision of what is going on. They are aware of this angle of viewing that they are using because there's a performativity to it. And they are performing these rites and they are substituting them for actual depictions because it's not about the real romance and the couple. It's actually about the performance of the rite of sex that has to be left at the shrine as a substitute for actually, instead of doing it at the temple altar, or consummating a relationship with, having a sexual union with a courtesan, which is mandated in certain rituals for public consumption. Instead of doing that, you as an elegant man put one of these tokens over there instead. You have a mimetic substitution instead of actually having to perform that ritual publicly. And this mimetic substitution becomes quite rampant at this time, and it's that kind of explains why we get all these depictions. So they can get small, like these tokens, but some of them are large, which are placed on the entrance gateways. And if you had any doubts that the angle of vision is something, and viewing is something that these artists were not aware of, think again. Their self-reflexivity of the urban Nagarka is such that this particular object left me absolutely astounded. Here is a man who is having sex with a woman, not looking at the woman, but looking at himself in the mirror while he is having sex. Freud or Lacan, who am I supposed to link this with? How many psychiatrists, psychologists in this hall? Where do I connect this? This self-obsession with his own vision while he is not engaging with the other. The reason for the sex is it's actually his own vanity, which is getting fulfilled through the eyes of the other or through the performance of the other. This is a very sophisticated thing that modern playwrights are quite aware of. And cinematographers like Kubrick picked up exactly on this when they made the film poster for Eyes Wide Shut, where Nicole Kidman is actually looking back at herself in the mirror rather than actually engaging with Tom Cruise at a very particular loaded moment in just before their separation. And so you see this kind of I think these connections. Artists and the public in India were clearly theoretically aware of the role of art in society. And that is what they are exhibiting, and I'm trying to get at in today's talk. So making art, as you can see, there's an artist who is making a portrait of the woman. They are quite aware of what the role of art is. I think this is what I want to end with. Art performs a certain role in society, and one which that society is theoretically, sophisticatedly conscious about and able to codify. I know I've run over time, but thank you all very much. You've been patient and heard me out. Ashokji, thank you for this.
Friends, it seldom happens that you walk out from a lecture changed in some ways. Many of us did not know what was being talked about before. And it is so revealing. As a writer, for me, it was so exhilarating to find the connections that he made. How literature came later. So, thank you very much for this brilliant. You raised the bar. I'm not taking you to the bar. Because I have to catch a morning flight. So I'm running up.
Excuses.
And thank you very much for that. We hope to publish these lectures in a book once we reach number 10, which means another 3.
Thank you.
And we need a script.
Right.
So thank you very much. And thank you very much all of you who have stayed on. It's very seldom that a speaker can hold you on for more than 1.5 hours. In fact, we hardly realize that 1.5 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great matching shirt too.